Happy day learners. I am Ms. Shankari from the Department of Social Sciences BA Sociology program, and today we will be learning a very important concept when it comes to women's development. So before we move into the topic, I would like to introduce you to what is women's development. We all know the meaning of development, and we all know that development has three main agendas, that is the political, economic and social development, whereas women's development is an emerging discipline or an emerging thought or discourse in the development studies which places women in the center of discourse when it comes to development. Now, why do we need to place women in the center of development discourse? That is because there is an issue of unequal benefits. Every developmental program has certain benefits which are supposed to be equally distributed to the members of the society. However, this is not the case in most of the developed or developing nations or underdeveloped nations. The case of women being left out in the development process is very high globally. There is also an issue of inclusion in development planning and implementation. When it comes to planning of development, we see that most of the development programs and policies, even before they come into the implementation stage, they often neglect the needs of the women's population. Also, that development can undermine the role, status and position of women in society. The various development policies, etc., they have a direct influence on how women occupy certain key positions in their respective societies. And finally, development affects men and women differently. We can never say that development is a one-size-fits-all. The same development policy might have different impact on different communities, and if we consider women to be one such beneficiary community or a community in the process of development, we see that these impacts are different. These are the reasons why we need to focus on women's development as different or as a different component from general development. Now, there are various approaches. How do we begin with women's development? And various scholars have given different approaches, and these are theoretical as well as practical approaches when it comes to women's development. The first one is called the Women in Development approach, which is abbreviated as WID. Then there is Women and Development approach, which is WAD. Gender and Development, GAD, and Mainstream Gender Equality, MGE. Starting with Women in Development. The Women in Development approach emerged in the 1970s, and it was mooted by a Washington-based network of female development professionals. Now, there were some factors which led to the development of the WID approach, but before that, let us understand what are some of the central ideas of the WID. It gave primacy to women's productive roles and integration into the economy as a means of improving their status. Now, most of the women's studies, they tend to segregate the women's role in society into productive and reproductive roles. Now, reproductive roles are those roles played by women as part of a family institution or a part of a marriage institution. It's not per se just the reproduction as a process, but it also includes things like domestic chores, their responsibilities in a household, etc. And the productive roles, on the other hand, they emphasize on how women contribute to the economy and the building of the society. Now, WID particularly focuses only on the productive roles of women. Women's subordination, and by implication overcoming that subordination, was seen within an economic framework. Basically, it said that only when women become productive members and a part of the economy, that is when women's development can be achieved. Failures to acknowledge and utilize women's productive roles within and beyond the household were planning errors, leading to the inefficient use of resources, and it legitimates a woman-only focus in research and in the delivery of resources. Basically, when we tend to sideline or ignore the contribution of women in economy, it is considered to be a developmental error. The cost of investing in women's productivity are justified in terms of economic returns as well as social returns. Now, what are the economic returns? When we invest in women's productivity, say for example, a country is planning for a woman's education or upskilling, etc. On one hand, it is also improving its GDP. And on the other hand, we also have social returns in terms of development of women as a gender. Now, as I told you, there were some factors which led to this women in development the growth of women in development as an approach. And the first one we see is in the 1970s, there was a universally or globally, we would say that the women's movement was gaining a lot of momentum. The idea of liberal feminism and Marxist feminism and many such types of feminisms became more and more important, and they were taken to the level of social movements. Secondly, we see a very important a milestone work, I would say, by Esther Bosserup. She did her study on women's role in economic development, which was in the year 1970. She basically studied the agrarian economies of Africa, and she tried to find out how African women contributed to the agrarian economy. Now, this was the first ever work which identified as well as measured the contribution of women in development. And also in 1973, there was something called a Percy Amendment. The US had an act, or through various legislations, it had the practice of giving grants and aids to developing nations. Now, this Percy Amendment made it mandatory for developing countries to include women's development as an agenda in their national policies, and that is when they can receive aids from US. Now, this was again a landmark amendment, because for the first time we are making women's development a part of compulsory policy making. So, this is all about the WID. Now, moving on to the next one, which is the WAD, Women and Development. It originated in the late 1970s. It is based on the neo-Marxist feminist approach, and it's based on dependency theory. A little bit about dependency theory. Basically, it divides the entire globe into the first world, second world, and the third world country, and it talks about how these three are interdependent on each other based on a core and periphery model. And then some of the central ideas of women and development. Now, this kind of refutes with WID, and it says women have always been part of the development process. Their works, both within and outside household, is central to the maintenance of societies. Unlike WID, which said that women's contributions and women's role in economy have been excluded, WAD argues that women have always been part of development. Women's position will improve if and when international structures become more equitable. And here is where we see the connection with the dependency theory. WAD believes that only when women or only when international structures start supporting women, that is when we can see an improvement in women's development. It discourages strict and analytical focus on women's issues because both sexes are disadvantaged under the oppressive global structure. So, the larger schema of issues here is the global structure and not things like patriarchy or just women, or it is not only about one single gender or one single sex. Both the sexes are in fact disadvantaged due to a kind of oppressive global structures. And it does not give much attention to the ideology of patriarchy. Thus, women's condition is seen within the structure of international and class inequalities. So, women, whatever women go through or whatever developmental disparities women have is due to class inequalities as well as certain discrepancies in the global power structures. Now, both WID and WAD, both of them have certain weaknesses. They focus only on the productive sector of women. As I already told you, when we analyze the contribution of women, we have to look at both productive as well as reproductive sectors. And that is why GAD emerged, that is gender and development. It originated in the 1980s. It emerged as an alternative to WID, and it is based on social feminism. Some of the central ideas of GAD: it looks at a holistic perspective. It looks at the totality of social organization, economic and political life of women. It targets the social construction of gender. See, I think here most of us know the difference between sex and gender. Sex is biological, gender is social, right? When we are born, our sex is determined, but what makes us women is our culture. Like in the context of Indian culture, a woman is supposed to know how to cook. A woman is supposed to be, behave in a particular way, etc. And every culture has its own definition of who is a woman. So here the central problem is the definition of the term woman or the social construction of gender. The ideology of patriarchy operates within and across classes to oppress women. It analyzes the nature of women's contribution within the context of work done within as well as outside the household. Unlike WID and WAD, which only focus on productive roles, GAD also looks at the reproductive roles that women play. It emphasizes on the participation of state in promoting women's emancipation. State has to step in. There is no way that the state can be silent spectators to developmental discrepancies, especially based on gender. It sees women as agents of change rather than passive recipients of development assistance. It stresses on the need for women to organize themselves into stronger political voice. Only when women stand up for themselves and they become part of the development process, that is when women's development can be achieved. So practically, GAD focuses on women's legal rights. And the outcome of GAD is not just women's development, but a fundamental re-examination of the social structures and institutions which contribute to gender construction. And finally, we have the last approach, which is the mainstream gender equality. It originated in 1995 at the UN conference, the 4th UN conference on women in Beijing, China. It basically believes that the idea of gender equality should be mainstreamed in the society. It ensures that all gender issues are addressed and integrated in all levels of society, politics and programs. The inclusion of both women and men in every development project was the only way to succeed and progress in a nation and economic growth and development. All this can be achieved only when the idea of gender equality becomes a part of our lifestyle or becomes a part of our life. That is called mainstreaming. And here is a beautiful definition given by ECOSOC: the process of assessing the implications for women and men of any planned action, including legislation, policies or programs in all areas and at all levels. It is a strategy for making women's as well as men's concerns and experiences an integral dimension of the design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of policies and programs in all political, economic and societal spheres. Why? So that women and men benefit equally and inequality is not perpetuated. The ultimate goal is to achieve gender equality. So basically, this approach believes that once we bring in gender equality as part of the mainstream system, development is automatically ensured. To sum up, we saw 4 approaches to women's development, the first one being WID, the second one being WAD, both focused on the productive roles of women, and then we saw gender and development, which focused on both the productive and reproductive roles, and finally mainstream gender equality, which believed that only when gender equality becomes a mainstream practice, only then we can achieve development. Thank you. Have a nice day.